The Lighthouse Keeper of the Dreaming Seas. At the edge of the world, where the sky folds into itself and time feels like an afterthought, there stands a solitary lighthouse. Its tower, ancient and weathered, rises defiantly against the endless expanse of the dreaming seas. A vast ocean where waves carry the fragile essence of mortal dreams. The light atop the tower, soft yet unwavering, casts a silvery glow over the ever-shifting waters, ensuring the dream tides flow unbroken through the veil of existence. Isolde, the keeper of this lighthouse, is a woman bound by duty and shadowed by solitude. She moves through the dim, echoing halls of her stone sanctuary with the precision of one who has lived the same day over and over again. Her hands, rough from years of tending to the lighthouse's mechanisms, betray the delicacy with which she performs her task. Adjusting the lenses, fueling the beacon, and ensuring its light never falters. The sea is her only companion. By day it glimmers with hues of gold and silver, each wave a fragment of a dream drifting from the waking world. By night it turns darker, the dreams becoming richer and deeper, often carrying whispers of unspoken desires or half-forgotten fears. Isolde listens to these whispers, though she never speaks to them. The waves tell her secrets she has no wish to know, yet cannot ignore. But there is a price for such vigilance. The dreaming seas, for all their beauty, are treacherous. The dreams they carry are fragile, and without the lighthouse's guiding light, they would scatter and dissolve into chaos. Isolde has always understood this. The lighthouse is her charge, her purpose, her prison. She is not immune to the loneliness that coils around her like the sea mist. There are moments when she stares out at the endless horizon and feels a pang of longing, though for what she cannot say. A voice, perhaps, other than her own. A touch to remind her she is more than a custodian of light. Yet she buries these thoughts deep, like one might bury a fragile treasure, fearing it might break beneath the weight of hope. One evening, as the sun sinks into the waters and the sea shifts into its twilight form, something changes. The waves, usually so serene, begin to churn. Isolde watches from the lighthouse's balcony, her brow furrowed. The water darkens, not with the usual richness of night dreams, but with a shadow that feels unnatural, menacing. A low hum vibrates through the air, a sound that seems to come from deep beneath the waves. She descends the spiral staircase to the beacon room, her steps quick but steady. The great lens of the lighthouse is already lit, its light cutting through the gathering gloom. Yet even as it shines, the shadows below deepen. For the first time in years, she feels a tremor of unease. Something is wrong. She returns to the balcony and peers out at the horizon. The hum grows louder and the waves grow higher, crashing against the rocks below with an urgency that sets her teeth on edge. Then she sees it, a ripple of darkness spreading across the sea, swallowing the shimmering waves of dreams. It is as if the sea itself recoils from this encroaching shadow. The dreams pulled back into its depths, as if seeking refuge. The shadows rise higher, taking form. They are indistinct, shifting shapes that flicker and dissolve like smoke caught in a wind. Yet their presence is palpable, a cold weight pressing against her chest. She has heard tales of nightmare storms, whispered by the waves on restless nights. They are rare, born of collective fears and anguish, capable of unraveling the delicate balance of the dreaming seas. But she had never believed she would witness one. The shadows creep closer, their presence a stark contrast to the light of the lighthouse. Isolde grips the railing, her knuckles white. The hum transforms into a low, resonant growl that seems to come from the heart of the storm itself. She feels it then, a tug at the edges of her mind, a whisper that is not a whisper, a voice that seems to rise from within her own thoughts. You cannot hold the tide alone. She stiffens, the voice sending a chill down her spine. It is not the sea speaking, nor the dreams. It is something older, something deeper. She looks out at the waves, the storm brewing ever closer, and for the first time in her life as a keeper, she feels afraid. But fear is a luxury she cannot afford. With a deep breath, she turns back to the beacon, its light her only shield against the encroaching storm. Yet even as she tends to it, a single thought lingers, unbidden and unwelcome. What if the light is not enough? The lighthouse's beacon blazed defiantly against the encroaching shadows, but Isolde could sense its struggle. The light, which had always seemed infinite, now felt fragile, flickering as if testing its own limits. Outside, the sea churned with a restless ferocity, the once shimmering waves consumed by tendrils of shadow that spiraled and twisted like living things. Isolde paced the beacon room, the rhythmic clang of her boots echoing against the stone walls. Her hands fidgeted with the brass mechanisms, tightening and adjusting them despite their perfection. The hum of the storm seeped through the walls, vibrating the air, and with it came faint whispers, fractured and indistinct, like a half-remembered song. She stopped abruptly, turning her head toward the sound. It wasn't just the storm. The whispers were layered, overlapping like the voices of countless dreamers, each one carrying an edge of desperation. She closed her eyes and concentrated, straining to decipher them. Lost. Too late. The light fades. The words slithered into her consciousness, clawing at her resolve. She clenched her fists, forcing her breathing to steady. The dreaming seas had always whispered, but this was different. These voices carried fear, despair, emotions that fed the nightmare storm, giving it form and strength. Suddenly, a loud crack split the air, and the lighthouse trembled. Isolde braced herself against the wall, her heart racing. She ran to the balcony and looked out. The shadows had grown, stretching high into the sky like storm clouds, their darkness punctuated by flashes of crimson and violet lightning. The hum had deepened into a guttural roar, the voice of a storm that hungered. Isolde's gaze swept the horizon, searching for anything familiar amidst the chaos. It was then she saw them, small, glimmering motes of light scattered among the waves, flickering like fireflies caught in a gale. Dreams. The storm hadn't consumed them entirely, but they were weak, their light struggling to persist against the overwhelming dark. She gripped the balcony railing, frustration and helplessness gnawing at her. For years, she had believed her light was enough, that her solitary watch over the seas was all the dreaming realm required. Yet now, faced with this storm, she realized how brittle that belief had been. You cannot hold the tide alone. The voice returned, low and resonant, yet strangely calm amidst the chaos. Isolde froze, her pulse quickening. She scanned the room, half expecting to find an intruder, but there was no one. The words seemed to echo from within her own mind, a thought not entirely her own. She shook her head, retreating into the beacon room. Her hands found the journal she kept, a leather-bound book filled with sketches of the seas and notes on the lighthouse's workings. Desperation drove her to flip through its pages, searching for any forgotten insight, some instruction or clue. Page after page revealed nothing but diagrams and records of the tides. Until, near the back, her hand froze on a page she had written years ago. The light guides, but it does not heal. The sea answers only to the many, never to the one. She read the words again, her mind racing. The sea answers only to the many. Her entire existence had been one of isolation, of believing she alone could bear the burden of guiding the dreaming seas. But if that belief was flawed, then so was her light. The storm surged again, sending a pulse of dark energy crashing against the lighthouse. The beacon flickered, its light dimming for a breathless moment before reigniting. Isolde clutched the journal tightly, her mind reeling. If the sea required more than her solitary strength, where would she begin to seek help? Her thoughts were interrupted by a sound, a faint, rhythmic splash. She stilled, straining her ears. It came again, steady and deliberate, cutting through the roar of the storm. A boat! Isolde ran to the balcony, her eyes scanning the chaos below. Through the swirling shadows, she caught a glimpse of movement. A vessel, small and delicate, forged of translucent glass, rode the waves with uncanny ease. At its helm stood a figure cloaked in grey, their face obscured by the fog and storm. The whispers grew louder, merging into a chorus that filled the air. Not alone, not alone. Isolde's breath caught. A part of her longed to call out, to summon the figure closer, while another part hesitated, wary of trusting anything born of this storm. But as the boat drew nearer, The shadowy tendrils recoiled from it, as if repelled by its presence. The figure raised their head, and though their face remained hidden, Isolde felt their gaze pierce through her. A voice, low and steady, rose above the storm, not as a whisper, but as a command. "Keeper, your light is strong, but it is not enough. Will you let me in?" For a moment she hesitated, her heart warring with doubt. But as the lighthouse shuddered under the storm's fury, she made her choice. She reached for the lever that controlled the beacon's shutters and pulled it open, letting its full light flood out into the storm. The boat surged forward, carrying the figure toward the lighthouse, and for the first time in years, Isolde felt something stir in her chest. Hope. The boat glided closer, defying the chaos of the storm as though guided by an unseen hand. Its translucent hull shimmered faintly, reflecting the dimming light of the beacon above. Isolde watched from the balcony, her pulse quickening. The figure standing at the helm remained cloaked in grey, their features obscured by the fog and the flurry of shadows. Yet there was something about their presence, a quiet strength, a sense of familiarity in the unknown that kept her rooted in place. When the boat reached the jagged rocks below, the figure stepped ashore with fluid grace. They carried no lantern, no weapon, only a staff of pale wood that glowed faintly with its own inner light. The storm seemed to recoil from them, the shadowed tendrils curling away as though repelled by the faint aura surrounding them. The figure raised their head, and their voice, calm yet resonant, carried through the howling winds. "Keeper of the light, I have come as the sea willed. Will you grant me passage?" Isolde hesitated. The storm's whispers still echoed in her mind, each one laced with doubt and fear. Trusting a stranger, here and now, felt like a gamble too great to take. Yet, as her eyes drifted to the storm-choked horizon and the trembling beacon above, she realized she had no other choice. She called down, her voice steady despite her unease. "Come, the light is yours for now." The stranger ascended the winding stairs of the lighthouse with a measured pace, their footsteps soft but unyielding against the stone. When they reached the beacon room, Isolde stood waiting, her hands gripping the edges of a table as though anchoring herself against what she could not predict. Up close, the stranger's features became clearer. Their face was youthful yet ancient, the kind that seemed carved by time itself, smooth but etched with unspoken wisdom. Their eyes, pale as moonlight, met hers without hesitation. "You've held this light alone for too long," they said, their tone devoid of judgment, only truth. Isolde straightened, bristling slightly at the words. "It's been enough," she replied, her voice clipped. "Until now." The stranger tilted their head, studying her. "Enough for dreams, perhaps, but not for what comes now." They gestured toward the sea beyond the window. The storm raged on, darker and fiercer than before. the nightmare shadows rising like a wall intent on consuming the lighthouse itself. "What are you?" Isolde demanded, her voice sharper than intended. "Why are you here?" The stranger placed their staff against the wall and stepped closer to the window, gazing out at the storm. "I am Kael, a wanderer of the dreaming seas," they said simply. "And I've come because the light called to me, because it knew you would need more than solitude to face this." Kael turned back to her, their expression unreadable, but their gaze steady. "This storm isn't merely a force of nature. It's a reckoning, born of fears left unspoken and dreams abandoned by those who've forgotten how to hope. It will consume everything if it isn't calmed, and your light, though strong, cannot stand against it alone." Isolde felt a flare of defensiveness rise in her chest. "I've kept this light burning for years," she said. "I've guided the tides, kept the balance. What would you have me do differently now?" Kael approached her, their voice softer but no less firm. "Let others share the burden. Open the light to more than just yourself." Isolde looked away, her grip on the table tightening. The idea of relinquishing even a fraction of her control unsettled her deeply. For so long, the lighthouse had been her domain, her purpose. Sharing it felt like exposing a part of herself she wasn't ready to confront. But Kael stepped closer, their voice lowering to a near whisper. "You fear that opening the light will weaken it. But what if it strengthens it instead? What if the light becomes more powerful when others join you? When it reflects the hopes of many instead of just one?" Isolde closed her eyes, the storm's whispers pressing in on her mind. Kael's words struck something deep within her, a truth she had buried beneath years of routine and isolation. She didn't answer, but her silence was enough for Kael to continue. "The storm feeds on fear and isolation," they said, "but it cannot withstand connection, unity. Let me help you. Together, we can find the dreamers who still believe in light, and we can turn their belief into a force that calms the tides." Isolde opened her eyes, meeting Kael's gaze once more. Their presence, though unfamiliar, felt steady, grounding. The storm outside roared louder, as though sensing her wavering resolve. Finally, she nodded, her voice quiet but resolute. "Very well. Show me how." Kael smiled faintly, their hand brushing the pale staff as it pulsed with faint light. "Then let us begin. The sea is waiting." And with those words, they turned toward the door, Isolde following close behind. Her heart a mixture of fear and something she hadn't felt in years, hope. Together, they descended the tower, stepping into the storm and the unknown beyond. The storm greeted them with a roar that shook the earth beneath their feet. The lighthouse, its walls solid as time itself, groaned against the unrelenting force of the nightmare winds. Kael led the way down the cliffside path toward the waiting boat, his staff glowing faintly, a fragile beacon against the oppressive dark. Isolde followed, her jaw set, her steps measured but firm. She carried no weapon, only the weight of years spent in solitude and the fragile hope that Kael's strange wisdom might be enough to save the dreaming seas. The glass boat bobbed gently in the churning waves, untouched by the fury that surrounded it. As they climbed aboard, the shadows surged closer, their tendrils clawing at the edges of the boat as though testing its resolve. Kael's staff pulsed, sending a ripple of light across the hull, and the shadows recoiled with a hiss. "Stay close to the light," Kael said, his voice steady despite the chaos. The boat moved without sails or oars, gliding across the water as if guided by the light of the staff. Around them the sea writhed, its surface marred by the storm's malevolence. The once glimmering waves now churned with dark, viscous shadows, swallowing the faint motes of dreams that still lingered. Isolde gripped the boat's edge, her gaze fixed on the horizon. The storm loomed ahead, a wall of darkness pierced only by flashes of crimson lightning. The whispers returned louder now, a cacophony of despair and fear that seemed to rise from the depths of the sea itself. "You cannot stop this. Turn back. The light will fail." She clenched her fists, willing the voices away. "How do we fight this?" she asked, her voice sharp, cutting through the storm's din. Kael turned to her, his pale eyes calm yet resolute. "We don't fight it," he said. "We listen. We find the dreamers who still believe, those whose light can merge with yours. Only together can we calm the tides." Isolde frowned, her brow furrowing. "And how do we find them in this chaos?" Kael smiled faintly, the expression barely visible in the dim light. "The storm itself will show us." Before Isolde could question him further, the boat veered sharply to the right, as though drawn by an unseen current. She staggered but regained her balance, her heart pounding. Kael stood at the helm, his staff raised high, its glow intensifying. The boat slowed as they approached a shimmering figure adrift on the darkened waves. It was faint, almost ethereal, a young woman clutching a lantern that flickered weakly, its light barely holding against the encroaching shadows. "Who is she?" Isolde asked, her voice hushed. "A dreamer," Kael replied. "One whose light still burns, but only just." The boat stopped, and Kael extended his hand toward the dreamer. "Take my light," he said, his voice gentle yet firm. The dreamer hesitated, her form trembling as the shadows closed in. Then, with a trembling hand, she reached out, her lantern touching the staff. A surge of light erupted, weaving through the storm like a thread of gold. The shadows recoiled, retreating further into the depths, and the dreamer's figure grew brighter, her light merging with the staff's glow. Kael turned to Isolde. "This is how we calm the storm, one dreamer at a time." They pressed onward, the boat moving with renewed purpose. Time seemed to warp as they traversed the tempest, each moment stretching into eternity. One by one, they found other dreamers, figures scattered across the sea, their lights dim but unyielding. Each time, Kael's staff wove their light into the beacon, strengthening its glow. But the storm grew angrier with every dreamer they saved. The shadows writhed and lashed out, their tendrils striking the boat with violent force. Isolde gritted her teeth, her hands gripping the edge as the boat rocked wildly. "Why does it resist us?" she shouted over the roar of the storm. "Because it feeds on their fear," Kael replied. "And as we take the dreamers back, we starve it." They approached the heart of the tempest, where the shadows were thickest, their forms twisting into monstrous shapes. The whispers became a deafening chorus, their words slicing through the air like shards of ice. "Turn back. You are not enough. The light will fail." Isolde's chest tightened, the weight of the voices pressing down on her. But then she felt Kael's hand on her shoulder, steady and warm. "Do not listen to them," he said. "The light will hold, but only if you believe it can." She met his gaze, his pale eyes unwavering. Slowly she nodded, drawing strength from his presence. The boat reached the storm's center, a swirling vortex of darkness and crimson light. At its core stood a massive figure, its form shifting and amorphous, a creature born of the nightmares it had consumed. Isolde felt its gaze pierce her, its whispers burrowing into her mind. Kael raised his staff, its light flaring brighter than ever before. "Now, Keeper," he said, "open the light, let them in." Isolde hesitated, her heart pounding. But then she thought of the dreamers they had saved, of the fragile but unyielding hope she had seen in their eyes. With a deep breath, she closed her eyes and reached out, not just to the light, but to the countless dreamers whose hopes and fears had shaped the storm. The lighthouse's beacon flared, its light piercing through the darkness, and the storm roared in defiance. But Isolde stood firm, her heart steady, as the light began to weave its way into the nightmare. The light surged from the lighthouse like a living force, rippling across the churning waves of the dreaming seas. Its radiance, once solitary and contained, now burned with a collective warmth, a tapestry woven from the fragile hopes of the dreamers Isolde and Kael had reached. The storm writhed against it, the nightmare shadows roaring as they twisted and coiled, but the light did not falter. It pierced through the vortex, illuminating the heart of the tempest. At its core stood the nightmare-given form, a towering figure of darkness and crimson, its shapeless mass shifting and swirling like smoke caught in a hurricane. Eyes, countless and ever-changing, opened and closed across its surface, each one reflecting the fears and despair it had consumed. It let out a deafening roar, the sound reverberating through the sea and sky, and the shadows lashed out at the boat in fury. Isolde gripped the edge of the vessel, her heart pounding. Kael stood beside her, his staff glowing with the combined light of the dreamers they had saved. The storm's whispers battered against her mind, desperate and venomous. You are too small. You cannot stop us. You are alone. The last whisper struck her like a dagger, cutting deeper than the rest. For so long she had believed it. She had lived in isolation, convinced her solitude was both her burden and her strength. But now, as she stood amidst the chaos, surrounded by the shared light of countless dreamers, she realized the truth. She had never truly been alone. Isolde! Kael's voice broke through her thoughts, urgent but steady. He held out his staff, its glow pulsating with a rhythm that mirrored the heartbeat of the storm. The light is strong, but it needs a guide. It needs you. She hesitated, her gaze flickering to the nightmare at the storm's core. It loomed larger than anything she had ever faced, a physical manifestation of everything she had feared: failure, vulnerability, the unknown. But as she looked back at Kael, she saw no fear in his eyes, only trust. Taking a deep breath, Isolde reached for the staff. The moment her fingers closed around it, a surge of energy coursed through her, and the whispers fell silent. The light expanded, wrapping around her like a cloak, and she felt the presence of every dreamer they had saved, each one lending their hope, their courage, their belief. Now, Kael said, his voice calm but firm. Step into the storm. The boat moved forward, gliding toward the heart of the tempest. The shadows clawed at the light, their tendrils writhing and snapping, but they could not penetrate its radiance. As they drew closer to the nightmare figure, Isolde raised the staff, its glow intensifying with every heartbeat. The creature's eyes fixed on her, its roar splitting the air. The storm swirled around it, the waves rising higher, but Isolde did not waver. She stepped to the front of the boat, her voice steady as she called out, "You are not the storm. You are what it left behind, and you do not belong here." The nightmare writhed, its form shifting wildly as if resisting her words. But she felt its fear, its uncertainty. The storm was not invincible. It was vulnerable, fragile, built on the foundations of fear that could not withstand the light. She thrust the staff forward, its glow merging with the lighthouse's beacon. The light surged outward, enveloping the nightmare in its warmth. The shadows screamed and dissolved, their forms breaking apart like mist under the morning sun. For a moment, everything was still. The storm's roar faded into silence, and the sea calmed, its waves regaining their shimmering hues of gold and silver. The nightmare figure, now no larger than a shadow, drifted away, dissolving into the ether as the light banished it completely. Isolde lowered the staff, her hands trembling but steady. Kael placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch grounding her. "It is done," he said softly, She looked out at the dreaming seas, now peaceful once more, and felt a strange sense of relief and sadness. The storm was gone, but the whispers it carried, the truths it forced her to confront, would stay with her. As they returned to the lighthouse, the sky began to brighten, the first rays of dawn breaking over the horizon. The light of the beacon, now strengthened by the dreamer's collective hope, shone brighter than ever before. Kael stepped back onto the rocky shore, his boat shimmering faintly as it waited for him. He turned to Isolde, his expression calm but thoughtful. The seas will call again, and when they do, you will not face them alone. Isolde nodded, her gaze steady. And you? Kael smiled faintly. I am a wanderer. My journey continues, but the light you carry will guide others to you. With that, he stepped onto the boat, and it glided away, disappearing into the mist. Isolde stood on the shore for a long moment, the sound of the waves filling the air. She turned back to the lighthouse, its light warm and steady, and felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. For the first time, she understood what it meant to share the light, and to never truly be alone.